Welcome to episode 176 of FBI Retired Case File Review with Jerry Williams. I'm a retired agent on a mission to show the public who the FBI is and what the FBI does through my books, my blog, and my podcast case reviews with former colleagues. Today, we get to speak to retired agent Michael Harrigan, who served in the FBI for 22 years. He initially worked general criminal and terrorism cases in the Kansas City Division and was on the Attorney General's Protection Detail and was a police training coordinator at the Washington Field Office. In this episode, he reviews the Violent Criminal Apprehension Program, ViCAP, the largest repository of serial violent crime cases in the country. And he talks about the Highway Serial Killings Initiative. Mike Harrigan was the unit's chief and oversaw the development of the web database, which allows client law enforcement agencies direct access to conduct independent analysis. He also provides case studies of several serial killers, including Samuel Little, who may be the most prolific serial killer in U.S. history. Later in his career, Mike Harrigan was assigned as the supervisory senior resident agent in the Farmington and Gallup offices of the Albuquerque Division, where he conducted and supervised criminal investigations involving homicides, sexual assaults, kidnappings, missing persons, and unidentified human remains, and was responsible for all federal investigations on 3 Native American reservations. After a few years, he accepted an assignment in Quantico, Virginia, as the chief of the National Academy Program. The National Academy, or NA, is the leading national law enforcement executive leadership institution, graduating over 1,800 senior law enforcement officers from every state and more than 40 countries. Just before his retirement, Mike Harrigan was the chief of the FBI Academy's firearms training program. Currently, Mike is a subject matter expert for EAGLE, a security and risk management service for which he provides consultation and expert testimony related to violent criminal analysis, the use of force continuum, police procedures and policies, and various issues related to policing Indian country. This episode is packed with information, so much so that we ended up talking for more than 3 hours, and so this is part 1 of a 2-part episode. But before we get to the interview, if you are listening to this episode on the day it comes out, Thursday, July 25th, I hope you're planning to join me at the FBI Myths and Misconception, a Manual for Armchair Detective virtual book club event on Zoom. You can learn more about it on my website, or if you're listening to this on a podcast app, just click on the link in the description of this episode to learn more about the event and my new book, FBI Myths and Misconceptions. Do you know who Tim Ferriss is? Well, he has a podcast too, and he recently conducted an experiment on the different ways his listeners could support him. Well, I don't need to do any experiments. I'll never have ads on this show, nor will I start a Patreon or crowdfunding account. But you can show me support and you can show me love by buying my books. Actually, I wrote FBI Myths and Misconceptions, a Manual for Armchair Detectives, especially for you. This compact book is stuffed with fun facts about the FBI. It will help you create FBI characters and plots for your next book or script. It will help you impress armchair detective friends with your knowledge about the FBI, and it will prepare you for a career in the FBI and avoid embarrassing yourself at Quantico. I want Myths and Misconceptions, a Manual for Armchair Detectives, to become the book to learn about the FBI. The book is available wherever books are sold. Thank you. Now here's the show. I want to welcome my guest, Mike Harrigan. Hi, Mike. How are you?
Good, Jerry. And yourself?
I'm doing great. I had an opportunity to read a brief bio to everyone so they have a clear idea of all of the things that you were able to do while you were in the FBI. And the funny thing is, I'm looking through everything and I'm like, oh my God, I want him to talk about that. I want him to talk about that. I had to say stop because this could end up being like a 10-hour interview. And so I would love for you to come back and talk about your time as the supervisory senior resident agency in the Albuquerque division, supervising agents who were investigating matters involving crimes in Indian country.
Oh, yeah. No, I'd love to.
That sounds fascinating, too. But we're going to talk about ViCAP right now. You were the chief helping to develop the Violent Crime and Violent Criminal Apprehension Program, also known as ViCAP, and also helped to craft the national publicity strategy for the Highway Serial Killings Initiative. I mean, wow. Where would you like to start?
Well, Jerry, let me just go back to how I got involved with ViCAP, because ViCAP is a little known program. Some law enforcement agencies, or many, know quite a bit about it because it affects their cases. But within the Bureau, it's somewhat of a smaller program. And ViCAP stands for the Violent Criminal Apprehension Program. And as an agent in the field, when I did investigative work, I had a couple cases that I'd sent into the ViCAP program for analysis, but I really didn't know how it worked behind the scenes. But when I was in D.C., one of my assignments, I was looking around for opportunities and I saw a posting for a supervisory job at ViCAP. So I put in for it and I got the job. And when I got there, I really had the opportunity to learn the program, work with some incredible professionals that had been in the program for many years and had dedicated their lives really to making a difference to our partner agencies out there, law enforcement agencies, and to the victims especially, which really motivated me. But the ViCAP, really, we say ViCAP is that's kind of the trade name, but really what it is it's a database. It centers around a violent crime database in which police departments around the United States send in certain types of crimes into this database. And there's a team of analysts there, crime analysts, that go through these cases and they look for connections. They compare the cases from one to the other, looking for cases maybe from different jurisdictions that could be linked. And I'll talk a little bit more in a few minutes about how they link that. But how ViCAP started, the philosophy of ViCAP, as so many other things, it started with a local police officer out in Los Angeles. There was a police officer out there by the name of Pierce Brooks. And Pierce was a detective sergeant. And he was involved in a case where young women were turning up, killed, strangled, and dumped in the desert out there in the LA area. And as he looked at this case, he realized as he looked for victims, he saw the similarity. He saw that, okay, this young woman was dumped over here, strangled with a rope. Another one was dumped over here. But there was no way for him to really find these different victims, especially when they were in different jurisdictions, except going to the library and looking at newspapers to try to see if anybody had announced a piece on a new victim being found out in the desert somewhere in Southern California. So long story short, he investigates this case, and there was an individual by the name of Harvey Glatman. He was the Lonely Hearts Killer, they called him. Amateur photographer. He would advertise for young women to do modeling. They would come to him or he would go to them. He'd kidnap them, sexually assault them, strangle them to death, and dump them in the desert. So he thought that he looked at these cases and said, look, this killer's doing it the same way. He's strangling them, sexually assaulting them a certain way, and that there's got to be a better way to look for different cases than going to the newspaper. So he really came up with the idea of trying to build some type of system where you could put all these different homicides into a system and that somebody can compare them and look for similar ones that are in different jurisdictions. So in 1985, computers had come into the forefront, the personal computing age, And he was able to go out there and he pitched an idea to the Bureau like, hey, why don't we put together this data from all these cases? Let's put it together and put it into a database and give us a way to compare signature and MO, which signature being really the compulsions that drive a killer that end up being exemplified in how they do their crime, to MO, which is kind of the methods they use to accomplish their goals in the crime. And so the ViCAP system was born back then in 1985, and he was asked to become the first program manager. By that time, he had retired from the Los Angeles Police Department, and he ran the ViCAP system. And the system grew from there, from a computer, a little PC desktop in which police departments would send in their information, and he would manually enter it into the system and look for comparisons. Then it grew from there. And he was key to getting congressional attention on this initiative and getting funding from Congress that helped launch the current ViCAP program.
You know, in a way, it's kind of strange because the program is similar to, say, art crime theft database or, you know, other stolen property, but you're talking about a database full of victims.
Correct.
You know how important it is, but my God, it also makes you sad that there's a database of human remains, and wow.
It is, and it's one of those things where, law enforcement in the United States is so good at what they do now. Really, it's such a professional field. So many technological advances, so many people commit their lives to making a difference out there in public service. So it's a phenomenal profession. But always what's hampered with serial kind of crimes is the fact that there's jurisdictional lines, and that within a certain county or city, a body shows up or a killer is caught. It's very difficult if that killer has traveled interstate, interjurisdictionally, and he's dumped bodies or had similar assaults, committed similar crimes in other jurisdictions. It's very hard to link those because really the only way to do that is the ViCAP system. And ViCAP looks at 4 different types of crimes they look to put into the national database. One is homicides and attempted homicides. And specifically not all homicides, where the killer knows a domestic killing or there was some type of disagreement between people, drug homicides, gang homicides. Those aren't the type that ViCAP look for. They're looking for types that could be part of a series: random, motiveless, sexually based homicides. Those are the ones they're looking for. Sexual assaults is another category. And generally, if it's a known or suspected to be part of a series, especially those committed by a stranger, any sexual assault where there's a breaking and entering, or there's an assault of a young woman or man even could be, in which the subject there's no connection to the victim and it appears to be random. That is extremely critical to get into ViCAP. Missing persons, where there's foul play suspected. ViCAP looks for missing person cases. Those are critical to put in where a person's gone missing and foul play is suspected. And then the last category is the unidentified human remains, is where the unidentified human remains are suspected to be a homicide. And the key to that is they're looking to match an unidentified human remain to a missing person. And even though DNA has come a long way in the last 20 years, there's still a lot of cases out there where DNA is not necessarily available from the missing person perspective, or the recovered remains may have been years ago and the DNA hasn't been entered. So matching the human remain up to an identity is critical right there. What the database looks at and what the analysts do is they look for the police departments to enter the cases. They look at victimology. They're looking at the lifestyle of the victim, the aspects of the victim, what the victim did for a living, all the hobbies and everything else about the victim that could tell a story on or potentially shed light on contributing factors for them becoming a victim, potentially. They're looking for the offender suspect information, even offenders that are, if offenders are arrested and charged, they want that information in there because there's a good chance, if it's a random crime, that they may have done this before somewhere else. So all the information about the offender or the suspect has to go in there. The MO, the modus operandi of the offender, how they did their crime, what they did. Let's say there was a sexual assault in a residence. How did they gain entry to that residence? Did they go through a basement window, sliding glass door? Did they feign a delivery? What did they do to get in? Not saying that that always stays constant in serial crime. That can shift because that's the way an offender is comfortable. He comes up with a shtick on how to get access to the victim, how to actually accomplish his goals. That's the MO. And that can shift over times, but many times, like we all do, we become very comfortable in routine, and the same with criminals. Dates, locations of where the crime was committed, where it was, crime scene data, very detailed information about the crime scene. Trauma to the victim, the cause of death, critical right there to have in there. Any weapons used, and also very detailed explanations of the sexual interaction between the suspect and the victim. And that's basically the core of your ViCAP system. And the analysts go in there, they look at that data continually, and they're always looking for matches. Now we ask ourselves, one of the things that comes down is why should departments and why should victims and victims' families ask about ViCAP to make sure their loved ones are in there? And the biggest thing is the fact that it is a good way to bring resolution to cases in which the killer is got no connection to the victim or maybe states or jurisdictions away. Case linkage, just being able to match up these cases and clear cases in which an offender's caught, let's say in Minnesota, but he spent time in Florida, he spent time in Arizona, he may have been in prison in California. And in those instances, did he commit similar homicides or sexual assaults in those areas that have not been linked to him? And our analysts, the analysts at ViCAP, can go back and build up his history of where he's lived and look down deep into those areas and see if there's those type of crimes that may match the one that he's charged with.
Do you also use it as confirmation or corroboration of his confession, of a serial killer's confessions?
Absolutely. Absolutely. As you know, serial criminals can be very manipulative. And of course, when they're charged with serious crimes, may put out information that could be true or might not be true. And it's extremely important to validate that information. And a lot of times, with prolific serial killers, which thankfully there's very few out there, so I don't want the public to get too worked up about this, but is that they'll at times confess to crimes, and sometimes they're good confessions, and they want to help clear these cases. Other times it may not be, their motivations may be different. So when they give generalities of where they may have killed someone or buried someone or assaulted someone, the analysts can go in there and try to search for those cases, because sometimes the cases aren't in ViCAP. That's the tricky part. Not every case goes to ViCAP. It's a voluntary database, so they have to go into public source databases and look through, using great tools like Google and others, is do searches and try to find news reports or missing person flyers or anything else. Families put up websites. They go into all these things and try to get information.
So is there somebody, an analyst back at the ViCAP program, who is also looking for cases that have not been submitted by police departments and they're inputting that information? Correct.
See, ViCAP has about 70,000 cases in it right now, approximately. But so many more cases are out there that are either historic, very old, were never put in. And again, this is an extra layer of administrative work on a department. Sometimes they either haven't heard of ViCAP, aren't familiar with it, or have manpower issues, and cases don't get in there. So the analysts at ViCAP, crime analysts, are highly trained and highly motivated to go beyond the database and look for any public source information possible in which to do searches and matches, wherever that lies.
Yeah, I do want to add, because you did mention that serial murders are rare, and then you just talked about 70,000 entries plus in the system. And
Yes.
from the FBI website, I have this in my book. My first chapter is about profilers and hunting serial killers. But from the FBI website, I have that serial murder is a relatively rare event, estimated to comprise less than 1% of all murders committed in any given year. So hopefully that will put people a little more at ease.
It should, because one of the things about the database was 70,000. You're looking at, some of these cases go back 50 plus years. There's newer cases. Many of them are solved homicides where an individual may have abducted somebody or killed somebody, and there is no others. That was the first killing they did. But it goes in there because, the departments, ever since 2008, the departments now across the country have direct access to the database. So every law enforcement agency can go ahead and enter the data themselves. And so the Bureau's position on this is you'd rather get more. And sometimes there's cases that aren't all that great for ViCAP. Maybe it's a domestic killing or whatever else that goes in there, in which there isn't a pattern. But we'd rather have them put more than less, because every time a linkage is missed, that's a potential offender that goes on to commit more, or more families that don't have resolution to their loved ones who are either missing or killed or assaulted. So we always err on the side of caution and say more is better. So of those 70,000, a very small number are actually related to serial killers.
And the other ones would be?
Others would be, like unidentified human remains that are found. It may or may not be part of a series. There's no way to tell until you do the linkage and actually clear the case. Missing persons where foul play is suspected. There's a lot of those in there. And some of those may turn out to be voluntary runaways or whatever else. But again, because a missing person, a lot of times, sometimes there is evidence that there's a crime or strong indication of a crime. There's a crime scene, there's blood, there's other issues. But sometimes a person has gone missing, and even though foul play is suspected, it's not known for sure. It's suspected. So a lot of those cases, missing person, unidentified human remains, sexual assaults that may meet the criteria because of the type of sexual assault it was. But, when it comes down to it, we want it in there, even if it turns out that it's not part of a series, because we don't know that at the time it goes in there. And once it's in, we leave it in. We leave it in there because, you never want to, again, erring on the side of caution. We don't want to remove cases from ViCAP that in the future may be beneficial.
And I think I'm getting it now. So let's say some human remains were found in a vacant building. Mm-hmm. That could be somebody who died of a drug overdose, or it could have been somebody who went into that vacant building to commit suicide, or just, died and the body wasn't found until, months or years later. That, of course, would be human remains that would be entered into the database because the person, you don't know who the person is. Mm-hmm. But we can't assume that, he was murdered by a serial killer.
Correct.
Okay.
Correct.
I got it.
Yeah, it's really driven by victims. The whole program is it's really driven by a deep concern for victims. And even though a lot of the victims in these cases are less than sympathetic in the public eye, many are prostitutes, many are drug users, many are homeless. We always look at them, as from a program's perspective, we always look at them, as law enforcement does too, as they're loved by somebody, missed by somebody, and they're human beings, and they need to have their families, who likely, really grieved over when they went sideways in life and hit unfortunate circumstances. They also deserve the closure that comes with the resolution of how their loved one died, why they died, and that whoever did it is held accountable. So that's behind the scenes that does drive the analysts to really give it their all.
And I know that you're going to share with us some real cases of serial murderers who were either identified through the program or whose victims were able to be verified through the program. And I know we're going to do that at the end, but this is just fascinating to me. And, that this program is out there because I do believe that it's a little known program, and I'm excited that, you're here today to talk to us about it, because as you just mentioned, when you think about the families who have no idea what happened to their loved ones, this program is vital.
It's extremely important. I agree with you on that. It's something the FBI does, and the FBI does this every day with partnerships. I mean, the FBI does, expends an incredible amount of resources and an incredible amount of support to local and state agencies. They've done that ever since the 1930s when the National Academy was created. These are programs that are there to support the larger law enforcement community with no expectation of there's no cost to law enforcement agencies to use this system. There's no cost to them. The analytical support costs nothing. All of it is really driven by the dedication to the greater good and for the national law enforcement network to really help out the nation's law enforcement profession. And that's the only reason it's there. I mean, the FBI doesn't look for any praise on this or any publicity. Like when I did the national publicity on, we'll talk about the Highway Serial Killer Initiative here, it wasn't in any way geared, the publicity, anything about, oh, look how great the FBI is. The only thing that drove us to do that was we knew that if we publicized it and helped more agencies get more cases in, that there would be more families, more loved ones that would have resolution on their cases, more cases that would get resolved. Because every one of the cases in ViCAP starts with a local agency where the body or the assault takes place and ends there. That's who drives these cases. All the FBI does is provide some critical assistance, but all the decision, the investigative process, the interviews, the evidence collection, the decisions in the case, that's driven by those local detectives. And ViCAP sees itself as a way to help them in the 21st century, especially with technology and everything, to give them the help they need to help make it easier and help to make it more likely to clear a case. That's what the whole thing is about. Victims' families, may be hearing this and saying, man, I wonder if my loved one is in ViCAP. One thing that happens is in any investigative process, in any homicide process, when a homicide happens or sexual assault, it's all hands on deck with any agency, right? They do the work, they run down, they're doing the interviews, the evidence collection, they're doing everything they can do. At some point, especially when there's no connection of the offender to the victim, and they've run down all the avenues and logical investigative steps, done the publicity, asked for the public's help, at some point you run out of leads, right? You run out of investigative steps. This happens routinely in a lot of these, especially as a case gets older. It's just natural. I mean, any jurisdiction has a finite number of investigators. And while these cases age, new cases come up, new homicides, new sexual assaults. And so every agency within their constraints of their resources, they have to balance all of that. So when a case gets cold and they've run out of things that they can logically do, they've run down every investigative lead. Now the case becomes cold. What do you do with it? One of the challenges is a lot of the cases, as they get cold, they get passed. A new investigator comes into the unit. Okay, Bill, the new investigator now gets this case that's 10 years old. You've got the case. He may make a few calls. He may go through the case file. He may do this and that, looking for new leads, look at following up information. But at some point, again, he runs out of things that he can logically do. So as a case gets passed from investigator to investigator and gets colder and colder, what ViCAP offers is the ability for that agency to put all that case data into the database that they can look at anytime they want, and that any other agency around the country can look at their data for possible matches. And what they'll do is when a new investigator takes over a case, they simply log into the ViCAP system. They can pull up by their agency all these cold cases. And in about 10 minutes, they can get the highlights of their case without having to go back through what could be terabytes of information on a case, hundreds of interviews. They can get the essence of the case really quickly so they can quickly understand what the case was about. And that's a good way for cold cases to maintain their relevance in an agency so that you can always look and see, okay, what are the unsolved ones that we should be focusing on remembering? So it keeps it relevant, keeps it at the fingertips of investigators, aside from all the other cases that naturally, just by the law of averages, go unsolved across the country. And that's one of the biggest points of ViCAP, I think, is a great benefit to the investigators. And secure database, Once they put it in, it lives in there forever. And it's a great way to share your data with every other country, every other jurisdiction in the country. That's really the essence of it.
And I guess the other thing, when you talk about cold cases and, a new investigator being assigned something that's 10 years old, we also had to remember that he's working new cases, new murders that are coming in, new victims, unidentified victims that are on his caseload. And so it's a matter of not necessarily priorities, but just time constraints. Should I work on this 10-year-old cold case that is very difficult, we've had difficulty in solving, or do I try to hit on these brand new cases where potentially the evidence and everything, concerning it is new and fresh and ready for
Absolutely. And that's resources, investigative resources. Every agency has to balance their priorities and how much work, how many work hours to put in each case, because it's not no department has endless resources. And newer cases generally require a lot of manpower, especially right after a crime is committed, to put it together and get it ready for the prosecution or to find who's responsible. The amount of hours can be staggering. I mean, it's not unusual when high profile cases happen to have hundreds and hundreds of interviews, many DNA collections and testing, all kind of investigative steps that just take thousands and thousands of hours to manage. At some point, many of those cases or some of the cases go cold. It's just the way it is, again, especially when there's no connection between the offender and the victim. And the other side of it is some of these old cases too. One of the things ViCAP does is with their partnerships with Department of Justice and National Center for Missing and Exploited Children and the National Missing Identified System through DOJ, all these other programs. What they do is they can offer a detective that wants to take a look at a cold case, specific support for maybe reanalyzing the DNA, going back into the old files and the old evidence that may have sat there for 10 or 15 years and bringing the detective up on the new DNA analytical technology that's out there, in which something may have been examined for DNA 10 years ago, nothing found, but now with new technology, a reexamination of that evidence can suddenly open up a whole new investigative lead for that detective and possible case resolution.
I'm thinking about the times that you see on the news or you read in the paper, that a severed head was found in a lake or a severed leg was found in a dumpster. And these are the type of entries that the local police department would make into ViCAP, because right now you just got a head or a leg and you have no idea, who it belongs to. But putting it into the ViCAP program, hopefully at some point you'll be able to either put all the body parts together and figure out who the person is, or identify other victims with, similar ways of having been killed.
Absolutely. I mean, you think of the challenge if a department finds a head, let's say a skeletonized remain of a head in California, and then you have maybe a leg or an arm, skeletonized arm show up in Florida. I mean, how do you ever make that connection? I mean, you hope that they can do the DNA extraction and analyze it and maybe link it, but that's dependent on both those parts, both those body parts having been the DNA being collected and entered into the system. But there's many of those parts that are out there that lie out there still, evidence in evidence rooms and coroner's offices, in which it predated the DNA system, in which there was no DNA drawn. And 30, 40 years ago, how do you go back and do that? It takes a concerted effort to go back to reopen those cases and take a look at that evidence and maybe retest those human remains to try to get them into the system. The other side of it is missing persons. I mean, that's why it's so critical that when a person goes missing, that law enforcement collect the familial DNA, or even better, the DNA from the missing person, from a hairbrush, a toothbrush, or something like that, and put it into the database as a missing person. That way the DNA sits in that national database. So if the body is recovered somewhere, they can do a quick hit by entering the DNA from the recovered body or body part and quickly match it. So that happens quite a bit now because of advances in cataloging, and that they're actually getting this stuff into the national databases or into the local state DNA databases, in which allows matches to be made. But cold cases are a challenge because that may not have been done.
I have a couple of questions, and then we'll go into some actual case reviews. And then I have a number of questions also that, I put a call out on social media and had a lot of people respond. And so we'll go over those questions too. But my question is, I actually know someone, matter of fact, an FBI employee whose brother has been missing for more than 30 years. Is that the type of thing where maybe she or her family would provide DNA samples and that it could be matched to see if any of the missing persons in the database have a match to their DNA, just so that they could, again, find
Absolutely.
closure?
Absolutely.
Okay.
That is critical to do that. And that can be as simple as reaching out to the department, the agency that has that case, that entered the missing person information where they were last seen. Whoever's got that case, even though it's probably been closed for years, there's no actionable leads, but absolutely getting that into the national database is critical.
All right. And then my other question, and you know what, this might be one that someone sent in. I'm not sure, but based on the information in the database, how many, and again, we're just talking about serial murderers, how many of them are concentrated, say like Jeffrey Dahmer, in one area? I think most of his killings were done in Wisconsin. Or how many of them are like Ted Bundy? I believe his were, in multiple states. I mean, do we have an idea of the people that are known, what percentage actually traveled and did murders, and what percentage just kind of stuck to a particular geographical area?
That's an interesting question. I don't have those statistics available at this moment. That'd be good to know, because, in a geographic area, even if you do have, let's say you have a city like St. Louis. Well, St. Louis has a huge number of different agencies within the city limits, right? I mean, there's all type of little jurisdictions tucked in there. So theoretically, you could have a small geographic area, but have many, many agencies. And if they're handling these crimes on their own, if they're doing their own homicide and their own sexual assault investigations, it's not beyond possibility that you could have an offender that travels 3 or 4 miles one direction or 3 or 4 miles another direction and effectively be in a different jurisdiction. So that can cause the same issues. Now, again, you may have media, you may have publicity that can pique a investigator's interest on a close by homicide that could be related, or you could have working groups that geographically many agencies have. Detectives talk to each other regularly to exchange information on cases they need help with. But sometimes being 10 miles away can be as much as being 2,000 miles away, depending on how the information gets out there for the detectives to be able to recognize the similarities. But, there's a mix. I mean, when we get to the highway serial killer initiative we did, I mean, that was all about the highway system. So that had to do, most of those victims or the offenders did travel quite extensively in those cases across multiple states and jurisdictions. And that's where ViCAP is most beneficial, because occasionally you'll have somebody that may commit a series of crimes within a city and are quickly caught. Let's say they do 3 or 4 sexual assaults. The police department identifies them, and it could be within 1 square mile. And so they identify them, they prosecute them, they convict them, and those 3 or 4 sexual assaults are cleared. Well, the perception is that, okay, we got them on all the sexual assaults. They interviewed them. They're pretty confident there's no others, DNA didn't match any others out there. But the challenge and why those cases should go into ViCAP, even though they feel as if they cleared all the ones, is that, are we sure about that? What's his history? Did he live in other states? Did he recently move there? Is there a way we can look around and maybe there are others that could match that the agencies that did the investigation just aren't aware of. So that's something that's important to look at too, is you can't always assume that, the known crimes are the only crimes that somebody's committed. Wow,
that's really interesting. I know here in the Philadelphia area, there was the Kensington serial killer, they were calling him. And he basically was sexually assaulting prostitutes in the Kensington area, which is a big drug area. Mm-hmm. I'm sure there's some great families that live there too, but it's known for a high volume drug trafficking. And so he was sexually assaulting the prostitutes, and then it got to a point where he began killing them. And, it was a very frightening time in the city for women, sex workers in the city. And of course, anybody, just to be worried about him. But, again, they caught him, but you're absolutely right. I hope that they did put him in the database, because maybe he does have relatives in say, Baltimore or Florida. And while he was there, he was also, sexually assaulting and then murdering sex workers. And I guess that's why, you keep bringing up sexual assault being in the database in addition to murder victims. And I guess that's why you do that there is this, what's the word I wanted to say, leveling up of doing sexual assault type crimes and then going into murders.
Absolutely. When you look at serial offenders, they're driven by a compulsion to do this. That's what they like to do. They like to kill people. They like to sexually assault people. And that's what drives them. And that's why they're serial offenders, because they do one, they enjoyed it. They do another one, they enjoyed it. That's what drives them to do these crimes. Versus opportunistic, like robberies. Someone may commit a robbery and, they steal, $100,000 and they execute the shopkeeper. Well, they're not doing that. The homicide is simply part of the way they're getting rid of witnesses, covering their tracks, so to speak. But that's not the point of them doing the robbery. The point of robbery is financial gain. The homicide is beside the point, right? It's just one of their things they do to cover their tracks or part of the crime. Versus the serial offender may cover their tracks by going into a place, and it could happen. They go into a place apparently to rob, but they're really there to sexually assault and rob the storekeeper. Or just kill the storekeeper for the thrill of killing, where robbery is not the motive. So there's a fine line there in something that a lot of times isn't necessarily apparent at the onset of investigations. Robberies could be more than that, or the other way around. A killing at the scene of a robbery could be just that, a ancillary to doing the robbery for financial gain. And that's why we say, get the cases into ViCAP, because you never know how they're going to turn out later on homicides. One big thing you look at nationally that's come into the spotlight is rape kits. There's a lot of sexual assault kits out there that were collected in good faith by law enforcement agencies or others, hospitals and others. They collect the evidence from the victim, and for whatever reason, the kits never got into the laboratory for analysis. And a lot of times, it simply comes down to the crushing caseload, administrative burden on the investigators. And unfortunately, many times at times there could be lax oversight and follow up at the supervisory level to these cases to make sure all the T's are crossed and the I's dotted. And so there's many of these kits that sat untested, sometimes for 10 years or more. And so the Department of Justice recognized that. Bureau of Justice Assistance came out with a program that ViCAP partners very close with, which is called the Sexual Assault Kit Initiative, SAKI. And that's a specialized program through DOJ where Department of Justice provides these grants to law enforcement agencies. All they have to do is ask for the grant, write it up, send it in, and ask for the grant. $42 million has been given out so far. And what they'll do is they'll grant a chunk of money to the agency to fund the inventory, for them to establish a system to inventory these kits, to track the kits from submission all the way through to adjudication of the case. They fund the creation of multidisciplinary working groups, from the sexual assault, kind of response teams that reside in different jurisdictions, to the investigators, to other personnel in the industry, in the medical industry, to look at the issues surrounding why these cases are sitting there and these kits haven't been tested, and to come up with policies and procedures to bring the agency up to speed on oversight and processes so they can make sure these cases get into testing. That's an incredibly valuable resource for local agencies to know about and to ask for the money, because, sometimes these cases can sit for decades. And, in fact, I could tell you a story. When I was working in the field after I'd left the ViCAP program, my wife had a good friend. Our kids played together, and the friend had mentioned to her, when she heard that I had worked at ViCAP and had worked doing serial crime type stuff, she related a story to my wife about having been a victim of a sexual assault when she was in college. A stranger had broken into her apartment she shared with several other young college students, had hid in a closet in the apartment. When she came in, she was assaulted by this individual, brutally assaulted, and the individual took off. Stranger. Nobody, obviously a stranger attacked. So she asked me, she talked to my wife, the wife asked me, and I said, sure, absolutely, I'd take a look at the case. So I talked to her and got some details and started checking around, and it turned out that the agency where the assault had occurred, and it had been 20 plus years ago, had lost all the evidence. So the assault happened pre-DNA, really pre-current DNA stuff right now, the technology. But if that evidence had been properly cataloged and preserved, there's a good chance that she could have had resolution to this case.
Wow. Because
that's a classic ViCAP case, a classic serial type case, is someone that does that to a stranger is we view it as it's likely, definitely a strong possibility that they could do it again or have done it before. So unfortunately, she never did get resolution because the evidence was lost, or the opportunity for resolution. And that's the unfortunate part. And that's part of this looking down in agencies now is it's so important for victims' families to reach out to the agencies or victims themselves and just ask, hey, where's that case? Hey, tweak kind of prod the investigator or the agency saying, hey, I was a victim many years ago. Can you take another look at my case? Not a bad thing to do. And most agencies are very happy to help the victim out and take another look at the case.
Could we, this is like an offshoot, but can we talk a little bit? Oh, I can't even think of the name of the program where the DNA is collected, CODIS. CODIS.
Yes.
Can we talk a little bit about that? Because I think the assumption for everyone is that there's a whole collection of DNA, and there isn't. It's not like fingerprints. Again, no. I talk about this in my new book, but could you talk about CODIS and how we do get the DNA of violent criminals so that we can match it to evidence in these type of cold cases?
Well, what happens is there's multiple layers of DNA repositories in the United States. There's we'll refer to it as local DNA systems that exist on a local county-wide area where there's a database set up, and the agencies enter their data through the medical examiners or through the laboratories into the local DNA database. And then there's a state-level database that state crimes and certain agencies may subscribe to that, and they put it into a state DNA database. Then there's a national database. It's called, NDIS, National DNA, I believe, is information system. But the national system where you got federal criminals, federal crimes, DNA samples from subjects or suspects are put into the national one. So CODIS really isn't a database. CODIS is more of a program. And what CODIS does is it constantly searches and sends inquiries down based on DNA profiles. Doesn't have the name of anybody in there, doesn't have anything, but it has unique identifying information that would link back to identities. And what they do is they send out inquiries. They link all these databases together. The computer searches for matches, and it searches, I believe it used to be once a week it would send out, or as needed, if they needed to do a special one. And it would look for searches. And when a hit comes up, it sends notifications to those two agencies saying, hey, we got a hit between your sample and this sample. You guys need to talk to each other and then compare. And then they would do the local agencies or the state agencies or the national would go ahead and do the technical match that would be sufficient for identification in the court. So CODIS is somewhat of a misnomer in the fact that it's not a national system. But it does reach down and effectively provides a national system. But whoever extracts that DNA, whatever jurisdiction does, really owns that sample, and they own the identifying information behind the sample.
Interesting. See, I learned so much stuff every time I do one of these interviews. All right, so we're at a point now. Do you want to talk about the highway serial killings initiative, or do you want to go into some of the actual cases that have been successful as a result of the use of ViCAP and the highway serial killing initiative?
Yeah, let me go into the initiative and explain what it is. There's an initiative that currently exists within ViCAP, it's a sub-initiative, and one that's based on work from an analyst, a crime analyst from outside the FBI, from the Oklahoma State Bureau of Investigation. And what many people don't realize is that the crime analysis profession is absolutely critical to agencies across the country, state, local, federal, for them to effectively do their jobs. Because the crime analysts are highly trained, highly educated, experts in the collection and analysis of data, as it would support both strategy on the strategy level of agencies on how they would an agency may go out and target. An administrator may decide where to put their investigative and their patrol and other resources of the agency based on crime analysts and how they look at the crime problems, the indicators, the trends, what's going on within the jurisdiction. And the other side of it is the crime analysts also can provide direct support to the investigators, because we really want those investigators to be out on the street doing what they do best. Investigators, what they do best is talk to people, gather evidence, gather both physical evidence and testimonial evidence. That's what investigators are best at doing. So if we can get them away from their desks and the crime analysts can go in there into the incredible volume of information that an investigator may collect and look at ways to make it efficient, organize their information to help the investigator find new leads, find new investigative directions, save them time. That's what the crime analysts do. And so out in Oklahoma State Bureau of Investigation, there was a crime analyst who did phenomenal work and who at times would call ViCAP. She was a big believer in ViCAP and would work with our analysts back here. And she had kind of a unique view in which she was looking for the potential of cases that could be connected to other cases. So she came across, from her investigators, they came across a series of seven homicides. And the 7 homicides, she noticed that out of Oklahoma, a couple of them that occurred in Oklahoma under her jurisdiction, Oklahoma State Bureau of Investigation, and they were similar, in which they were truck stop prostitutes that were killed, generally shot with a .22 pistol and dumped in a trash can or posed in certain ways by the killer in a truck stop or near a truck stop. And so she started looking, and she was able to come up with, on her own, she came up with several other victims in different states just through her database searches she did. And so she started reaching out to these other investigators and other analysts. And then she reached out to ViCAP and talked to a high-speed young analyst we had back in ViCAP who had actually come from a local police department, had been hired on by ViCAP. And this young analyst, she said, well, that's interesting. Highways, truck stops, prostitutes. So she used the existing ViCAP database to go in and look and see, well, is there a pattern? Are we seeing victims? We'd never really looked at that except for how it would be part of existing cases looking for linkages. But is there a large number of victims that could potentially have been victimized along the highway system? So she initially came up with almost 200 victims or suspects, even some suspects that had been arrested that had a connection to the interstate highway system. And that's what caused the analysts to come forward within ViCAP, working with the OSBI analysts, and started the initiative, the national initiative, to start cataloging these cases that happened on and along the highway system. And what made it unique was that the highway system, if you think about the interstate highway system as started by President Eisenhower back in the 50s, it's a perfect method, obviously, for commerce and for people to travel, vacations, and get work done. You can move rapidly from state to state, jurisdiction to jurisdiction, generally in commerce or travel, personal travel, professional travel, and get where you want to go in a very short period of time. But you look at the other side of it is the interstate highway system is a perfect venue for somebody involved in criminal activity to either move contraband or to commit violent personal crimes, in which they can pick up a victim, let's say, in California. They can kill the victim. Let's say they kill a victim then in Kansas, and then they decide to dump the victim in Missouri. Well, the victims from California, and maybe the offenders from Florida. Well, where the body's recovered has no connection to either the victim's history, where they're from. The offender has nothing to do with the jurisdiction in which the victim was recovered. So an investigator out there, absent strong forensic information of a suspect, has got now a body, may not know who it is, where they're from, may not know much about it except they can see maybe a mechanism of injury or death, and that's all they have to go on. So these cases in which bodies or victims are transported across state lines and the offenders also move interstate create an incredibly difficult hurdle for investigators to cross to solve these cases. So the analysts fired up this case, fired up this initiative, and started soliciting around the country for more cases and continued to do detailed database searches, both through public source information, newspapers, national teletype notices, all type of resources to try to collect these cases and catalog these cases in the hope of trying to identify some patterns. So the original case that the OSBI had brought forward, that case actually was solved. And it was solved, and again, not through the direct work of ViCAP. That was solved by the tenacity of the investigators on the ground, working together, communicating, and just good, hard police work. And what it was, it turned out that it was a trucker. In this instance, it was a trucker who was targeting truck stop prostitutes. Those are prostitutes that work the truck stops. And what they'll do is they'll use the CB radios and other methods to advertise their services. A trucker will respond. The prostitute goes up into the cab, does their transactions, and 99.99% of the time, the prostitute leaves and goes on with their business. In this instance, the prostitutes were getting into a truck driven by a guy named Bruce Mendenhall. And Bruce Mendenhall was a trucker who traveled extensively across, especially the Southwest and the Midwest, interstate transportation of all kinds of stuff. And he was big along the I-40 corridor, his business. So what happened was in 2007, that's when this case really started to pop, is that he was actually arrested at a truck stop in Nashville. He was arrested because the night before, a prostitute, surveillance cameras at the truck stop, had seen a truck pull out of a spot in the back of the truck stop, and a body was found in the trash can right behind where the truck was. And the truck was very distinctive, banana colored with a stripe on it, very distinctive truck. No license plate was visible or was captured, but the body was found there, shot with a .22 caliber bullet to the head, similar to others that had happened previously. And what happened was the detective out there, an outstanding detective, actually It was from Nashville, a guy with a detective with a New York accent who was just a tenacious investigator who had relocated to Nashville, become a detective there. He went back the next day, the very next day, he went back to that truck stop looking around, and he saw that exact truck pulling out of the truck stop again. So the killer had gone back to that same truck stop. He stops the truck on the highway and starts talking to the truck driver, Mendenhall, and he notices blood on the door of the truck, right on the door, blood. So at that moment there, he takes him into custody and he gets a search warrant, does the thing, and finds a bag. Tell me. Oh, he just didn't find a victim.
Oh, okay.
But he found DNA from multiple victims. I believe there were 5 victims. They found DNA, including a bag of blood that was in the cab. The cab was just a mess of blood everywhere. So he had been going along the highway, picking up these truck stop prostitutes, killing them and dumping them. They all had the same MO, 22 caliber bullet to the head. And that's what keyed our investigators at ViCAP. And as they worked on the case, when he was taken into custody, they had these DNA samples. But the problem was they didn't have necessarily the victim samples were not in the database yet because it had been all these happened over the course of several months in 2007. So they weren't matchable at that point. So what our analysts did is they started going into the ViCAP database and into public source information and then calling the investigator saying, hey, you might want to look at this one up in Illinois, or this one in Alabama. Looks like the exact same thing. Truck stop prostitute found in a trash can. And through ViCAP's assistance, then the investigators were able to pull in these cases, link them through the DNA, and then convict this individual of the homicides. So at the end of the day, I believe he was linked definitively to 5, and there's more that he was linked to after. And I'm not sure the disposition of those cases, but that's an example of how ViCAP can help in real time, because that investigator in Nashville and the investigator in Oklahoma were both people that were familiar with ViCAP and that talked to ViCAP on a regular basis about cases. That was a fascinating case because of the interstate aspect of it. That case was a more dramatic, example of how ViCAP helped. After that case, I started looking at all these cases. And when I did came up with a national publicity push to put together with our Office of Public Affairs to announce it to the nation, I said, we got to get this out there. We got to get it out there so that victims know, families know, investigators know, so they get these cases into ViCAP so we can provide the ViCAP services to potentially identify some of the unknown victims and also maybe provide the investigators some information to possible linkages that they can then talk to the investigators in another jurisdiction and maybe clear some of these cases. One of the interesting things was as I was giving interviews, USA Today and some of the other papers and news shows, was they kept hammering on truck drivers and saying, it's all truck driver issue. I said, well, not necessarily, because it's not, even though the truck stop prostitutes, which are a good number of the victims, prostitutes, drug users, there's also others in there. Regular prostitutes picked up in the cities. There's also drug abusers, hitchhikers, even the random motorists that had stopped along the highway that disappeared. Maybe their car broke down. So one of the perceptions was that it was truck drivers. I said, no, not necessarily. What we're looking at, we're not looking at truck drivers. We're looking at victims, and that had an association to the interstate highway system, either were found along the system or went missing along the interstate system, with the belief that if the offender got up on the interstate and went interstate or interjurisdictional, that it would be very challenging then for the investigator that ended up with that body or the victim in their jurisdiction to put 2 and 2 together and link them to the suspect. So that's what our focus was the ease at which people can move interstate. But it wasn't at the offset really intended to target truck drivers. Because, if you look at truck drivers, we think of truck drivers, they're out there doing their job. I mean, truck drivers are some of the most highly trained vehicle operators in the country with the CDLs and all the stuff they go through. Truck drivers are extremely committed to their job. Most truck drivers, the vast majority are just law-abiding, good men and women that are making a hard living, driving long distances, delivering what we need every day for the comfort of our lives. I mean, you can't get a Amazon package, right? You can't get anything ordered through the mail without a truck driver having a hand in getting it to our door. So looking at that, we say it's an honorable profession, but there are a small number in any other profession that use that cover to commit crimes. And that's one of the messages we did, so as not to denigrate truckers. And the other side is we didn't want the public to become, hysterical. Because look at TV. We would look at TV, how they portray profilers and it's fascinating. People love to hear the stories. But in reality, serial criminals are such a small number out there. And serial criminals are generally targeting those who are more vulnerable, drug abusers, prostitutes, those that live high-risk lifestyles. The average person in America is such a rare opportunity or rare chance of them becoming a victim of a serial offender, even up and along the highway system, that it's almost a non-issue for the average citizen. And that's one thing we wanted people to know is that, look, you watch the shows, you hear the news stories. Yeah, these are horrible cases, but in most cases, it's not your average citizen that's fallen victim to these incredibly evil perpetrators.
It's still just all so fascinating. Just thinking about these people who some will say, put themselves at risk. You had mentioned before, they still have families, they still have loved ones who care about them. And so they're still victims that deserve to have justice.
Absolutely. And, an unresolved case, like I look at my wife's friend that was a victim of that sexual assault, and you look at that and you look at the difference it made in their lives, the trauma they experienced. And this individual came to peace with it and actually turned around to become an extremely successful professional family person, and just really took that trauma and made the most out of life, and was, a very well-adjusted person. But you look at a person carrying that over the years, and you can't imagine what a victim goes through. Just the trauma, knowing that the suspect was never caught. And even the other concern would be wondering, does the suspect do that to anybody else out there? And, the fact that they could continue to do that, and there's other victims like them out there. Why it's so important to solve these cases and get these offenders behind bars where they can't hurt people again. That's one of the things you see with these serial crimes, is that a serial criminal who's predisposed or who has made the choice to do these type of crimes is a series. I mean, they're driven by these compulsions, and there's likely they're going to do it again and again and again.
I was reading on your resume that the systems are also linked. The ViCAP system is also linked with the National Missing and Identified Person System. Could you talk a little bit about that so that we have a full understanding of all the ways that this program is being utilized? Oh,
yes. Thanks for bringing that up, Jerry. The National Missing Identified System, the short name for it is NamUs, was developed by Department of Justice. It was developed in the mid-2000s. They saw that in the medical examiner community, there was tens of thousands of unidentified human remains cataloged by coroners and medical examiners that sat there unclaimed, unidentified. And the NCIC, the national basically database that law enforcement uses for all type of warrants and alerts, had a section in there for unidentified human remains. But a lot of the medical examiners and coroners, since it was a law enforcement only database, didn't have a method to get the data into the NCIC computer, which law enforcement uses. There was also the other side of it was, well, what about families? What about their ability to provide information and to be able to help out on cases, on missing and unidentified cases. What about the public's ability to look at unidentified human remains, not the gory part of it, but, composite sketches, information gleaned that could lead to an identification, such as maybe a description of a ring, or maybe a description of a tattoo, or maybe height, weight, composite drawings, artist renditions. Why not come up with something that would put this information out so that everybody in the United States could potentially go to this system and see unresolved matters and maybe weigh in and provide critical information? It was a brilliant move by Department of Justice to come up with this. So when they established the system, what I did when I was over at ViCAP is I started a dialogue with NamUs. We started talking to them, and they were, very scientific, very, they were developing this database. They had great philosophy. But what they lacked was the investigator's perspective side, the crime analysis side that ViCAP had. So what we did was we formed a partnership with them, and, they continued developing their database. They would consult with us, and we would talk to them. And I was able to get them for the first time to bring in an analyst, to actually hire an analyst that was an employee of theirs, to put them inside the ViCAP unit to be able to take the data that was being submitted by the public and by others into the NamUs database and provide a bridge to the ViCAP database so we could have somebody that could compare the two and make sure that we're also looking through NamUs and the public tips and the public information that came in through there. Because the essence of ViCAP is that it's a law enforcement only database. It has very sensitive investigative information, so the data can never be shared with a non-law enforcement agency. It cannot be physically, electronically shared. But what can happen is analysts can use, and they could do comparisons, either electronically or otherwise, with other databases. So NamUs took off. It's a great program, and it's something any public member out there can go to, any law enforcement agency can go to and look at it. And the NamUs system really is a phenomenal system in which it does have that. It's got a law enforcement side and a public side in which people can go in and look at drawings and descriptions of people that were recovered sometimes 40, 50 years ago, or human remains, and maybe provide a tip that would help an agency definitively identify a victim. When I was a first line agent, I handled a couple homicides directly that were federal jurisdiction. And I remember one in particular was a 2-year-old child that had been kicked to death by the stepfather. And, I responded out there, and, by the time I got out there, it was about an hour's drive from my office. The baby had been removed from the scene. The suspect was in custody. And, since it was my case, it was a federal homicide. I was the one to interview this individual. So I sat down with this individual and got the confession. He confessed. At first, he beat around the bush, and it was, he didn't know how the baby died and all this. But I didn't have any forensics at that point. You don't have anything at the when you're an investigator investigating a homicide. You don't have the benefit of the forensics at the time of response, because all you have is what you can see. And there wasn't much forensics there at the scene. A couple splatters of blood, but trauma to the body wasn't too visible. Baby had been taken to the emergency room, pronounced dead. But you look at that, and so I've got to dial down into get inside the mind of this individual, become their advocate in a sick kind of way. But you got to do that to try to minimize what they did in order to get their cooperation and have them admit that they're the ones that caused the death. And so when I finished that case, and, it didn't go to trial and it was pled out, and I think the individual only got 15 years for kicking this child to death, which I was livid about that. But I realized that when you look at victims, and this victim was, victim's mother was a military member, low-ranking enlisted member, and the individual that did the killing was live-in boyfriend, I guess would be boyfriend, was really more of the description. And you look at this and you say, so often these victims come from unfortunate backgrounds in which they don't have strong family support units, And in this one here, the family was kind of, of course, they were distraught about the death, but they were interstate. They lived somewhere else because the daughter was in the military, and she didn't have the best upbringing, and very low, didn't come from a very wealthy background, had very limited means. And you look at the child, repeated visits to the emergency room with abuse injuries and things that we found out afterwards. And you look at that, you realize the system really isn't geared in a lot of ways to really care for the victim, that they really become somewhat robotic in the prosecutorial system. They can become somewhat robotic in just taking these cases and just, robotically going through the steps to get the case through on top of the other 20, 30, 50 cases they have. And at times they can lose sight of the impact on the victim and their family. Victim advocates are phenomenal. The victim side of the house have great advocates, great people, professionals. But sometimes on the other side of the house, the tendency is for these victims to become just numbers and just part of the system. So at that point, seeing how the case went through kind of motivated me to set in my mind how important it is to really always consider the impact on the victim and their family, and to use that as a motivating factor to drive an investigation just a little bit harder, just a little bit more detailed, and for the prosecutors, hopefully, to do that just a little bit more, especially when a victim is a victim of these type of crimes where they had no role in their demise. At times you have less sympathetic victims, like two gang members shooting at each other, and one kills the other. Well, they're both chose to engage in an armed conflict with each other. That's a little less sympathetic than a victim of a robbery or a homicide that in no way played any role in their own demise through their lifestyle choices. And I'd put the same to prostitution, because there's no way a prostitute in any way engages in their risky behavior with the thought they're going to get killed. So that to me was a motivating factor that kind of defined for me as I moved on and I had these opportunities to get involved in crimes that affect victims, to integrate that into the investigative philosophy and how I tried to run these programs.
That's absolutely fascinating. I do want to use this as a teachable moment, and I'd love to provide education to people, especially people who write crime novels and crime dramas. And so I want to go back to federal homicide, because one of the things that irritates me so much when I'm watching a movie or reading a book is how they have the FBI involved in a homicide, in a local homicide that really you can tell it has no FBI jurisdiction. So I take it this happened on a military base. So why don't you explain how this particular homicide became one that was prosecuted under the federal law?
Good observation, Jerry. There's a lot of misconceptions about the role of the FBI and federal law as it applies to state law jurisdictions. And basically what you have is very limited areas in the United States where federal homicide, because, homicide there is a federal statute that covers homicide. It only applies to areas under what they call the territorial and maritime jurisdiction of the United States. And that includes times U.S. parkland, U.S. military bases, Indian reservations that are under federal jurisdiction. Those are the only actual territorial areas where a homicide has clear federal jurisdiction. And that's because wherever the crime occurred, at the location it occurred, the jurisdiction where it occurred is the one that has usually the first response to the scene, and they're the ones where the prosecutorial and investigative jurisdiction lies. So on military bases, if a military member commits a felony, that generally goes to court-martial. The military takes jurisdiction. If it's a non-military member on the federal reservation on a military base, usually a dependent contractor, somebody visiting the base that does a crime, then that has to go to U.S. District Court, because the military has no jurisdiction over non-military members. And the same would exist on tribal land. in the United States, if the tribal land is under federal jurisdiction, that the tribal law enforcement has no jurisdiction over non-tribal members. That has to go to federal court. And then even tribal members that commit felonies, certain felonies, have to go to federal court because the tribal courts are only allowed jurisdiction up to a certain point for usually misdemeanors.
That's very interesting. And for those who were wondering, how you came to investigate, this homicide of this young child, it's good to get that information.
It is. And, like when you're looking at these cases, like, Criminal Minds and the bureaus run around doing this stuff. Again, the bureaus get key support role for some of these homicides, but it's always based on the local agency requesting us to come in to provide technical assistance, whether it's our laboratory services, maybe some interview strategies, whether it's case consultations on whatever. But, 99.9% of homicides that happen in the United States are all local state jurisdictions. And those bureau has no jurisdiction to prosecute and charge a person through federal court. But what they do have is they have allowances under the bureau's guidelines to provide investigative assistance, where we, on request from local agencies, can go in and provide. And a lot of that, doesn't come from Quantico and profiling. A lot of it comes from even the special agents in each of our 56 field offices at times, or they get reached out from a local agency saying, hey, can you help us with this? How do I get stuff into the FBI lab to do an analysis on this firearm or this evidence? How do we do that? And the field officers are well positioned with their liaison contacts to then reach back to the resources at Quantico and then provide that information to the local agency on how they can get those resources. So it all comes back to that whole thing about the FBI supporting local law enforcement and providing help, not looking for credit, but really trying to help in the greater brotherhood and sisterhood of law enforcement, how to help them get their job done.
Excellent. Okay, Mike. So we have been talking now for over an hour and a half, and so
wow.
I can tell already that we're going to have to create this episode as a part 1 and a part 2. We've learned so much about the ViCAP program. We've learned about the Highway Serial Killing Initiative and the National Missing and Identified Persons System. So for part 2, I think what we can do is talk about some actual case reviews, serial murders that have been identified, or at least their victims verified through the system. And then we'll also address some of the questions that were sent in by listeners.
Sounds good.
And that's the end of part 1 of this interview. At jerrywilliams.com, you'll find a photo of Michael Harrigan. There are lots of links to news articles and videos about ViCAP. There are articles about all the programs discussed during this episode, as well as articles about serial killer Samuel Little. I've also included in the show notes a list of all the questions Mike Harrigan will be answering on next week's show. I hope you enjoyed the episode and that you'll share it with your friends, family, and associates. If they're not sure how to listen to a podcast, have them read my post on my website, How to Listen to a Podcast. And don't forget to subscribe to FBI Retired Case File Review on Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Spotify, Pandora, or anywhere you listen to audio. This podcast is where I talk about true crime. But if you also enjoy watching crime dramas and reading crime fiction, then you want to join my reader team. When you do, you'll get a copy of my FBI reading resource, which is a list of all the books about the FBI written by the FBI agents who have been on this podcast. True crime, memoirs, and crime novels. And, in case you missed the big announcement, FBI Myths and Misconceptions, a manual for armchair detectives, is now out and available worldwide as an ebook, paperback, and hardback, wherever books are sold. And guess what? My crime novels, Pay to Play and Greedy Givers, are now also available worldwide wherever books are sold. So if you enjoy reading police procedurals, I hope you consider picking up copies of the books in my FBI Philadelphia Corruption Squad series. I want to thank you for listening to the very end, and I hope you come back for another episode of FBI Retired Case File Review with Jerry Williams. Thank you.